Welcome, everybody. We're happy to have you here. And we're a bit scattered about the room. I thought maybe some of you could come to the first row to make Adam feel a little bit less lonely, if you would be willing to. We are very happy to have Adam, actually, as the opener, let's say, of the opening speaker for the Amsterdam Agenda, which is a multiple series, I think about 6 or 8 editions, on what Amsterdam can learn from other cities. I'm usually the moderator of Architecture Now, which is a bi-monthly talk show on architecture. And, well, today we talk about architecture, so that's really good. The Amsterdam Agenda is actually a lecture series initiated by the Academy of Architecture. So Adam was here yesterday already lecturing at the Waterlooplein. And they, let me see, yeah. So the idea is to talk about like cities like New York, Paris, Shanghai, Istanbul. And Adam Frampton, as the principal of Only If, is the first to open this series with lots of experience, first at OMA in Rotterdam and then on to Asia, and then starting his own practice in 2013, focusing on a wide variety of scales, actually, from city and regional design up to like plot scale design. So, and what's also interesting is the Dutch ties throughout your career, right? And also now based in New York, tied to or connected to, for example, Matthijs Bouw from One Architecture, as well as Florian Edenburg from Seoul. So we are really happy to have you here, Adam. The floor is yours. The idea is he has a presentation of about 30 to 40 minutes, and then afterwards we can discuss and debate more into detail the projects delivered to you. Adam.
Thank you, Indira, and thank you to the Pakhuis for having me here as well. I'm going to kind of present the projects through, I'm going to present our practice actually through kind of 4 chapters, but I'm really excited actually to participate in this discussion of the Amsterdam Agenda because I think it seems like there's actually a lot of parallels in a way now between New York and Amsterdam. Like Amsterdam, New York is sort of flourishing, and I think, you know, in spite of our, you know, kind of political uncertainty and regression, you know, the market is kind of moving forward, and the city is kind of growing, but in ways that are, you know, perhaps differential and kind of, you know, exacerbating the kind of inequalities which have always existed, and you know, the question of like how to kind of participate as a young architect, I think is sort of on our minds, and I think also from talking to people here, there may be a kind of similar feeling as well about Amsterdam, and so I guess that's kind of in a way, this, as I understand it, the kind of topic for the series. And so our office has, I think, very much a kind of ambition. We are working in many different scales, which I'll kind of go through. And we do have an ambition to kind of engage with these like larger forces of kind of city making and kind of social and perhaps kind of political questions. So there's 4 chapters. There's going to be about 10 projects, and there's a diversity of work because I think as an office that just recently started, we sort of do everything and anything we can. But on the other hand, we are really interested in like not becoming kind of specialists or sort of not focusing like singularly on one kind of part of practice. And so to start, maybe like understanding where we kind of live. And as Indira mentioned, before I came to New York, I was in Hong Kong for 4 years. This is the sort of city. And I think to kind of to think about where you live and to kind of engage is important to sort of have a framework for what you do. And looking at, you know, the kind of experience of being in and looking at Hong Kong as a city, of course, it's a very exciting place. But I think for a visitor at least, at street level, one can be, one might be struck by the kind of absence of traditional sort of urban legibility. So aside from the kind of traditional notions of like center, axis, edge, there's sort of a very unique form of three-dimensional public space in Hong Kong. And many of the kind of binary oppositions that we use to describe the city, like public, private, inside, outside, figure, ground, above, below, are sort of blurred or collapsed in a way in Hong Kong. And so this is a project, which is a book that I produced right before starting the office together with Jonathan Solomon and Clara Wong, and it's called Cities Without Ground, a Hong Kong guidebook. It's kind of a funny book because it's not like a historical book, it's not a monograph, and despite the title, it's not even really a guidebook insofar as that you could use it to like get around the city. What it does do is kind of record the certain spatial condition that we found to be really interesting, and so the book is basically kind of a series of 32 maps, which are the kind of these interconnected forms of pedestrian circulation, tunnels, bridges, overpasses, interconnected shopping mall, atriums, and train stations, and kind of quasi-public space. So the book is also kind of in a way, an attempt to sort of disprove the statement that Hong Kong has no public space. Which we kind of constantly, sort of encountered. What the series of drawings, which are almost like kind of a three-dimensional Noli plan. We also kind of annotate the series of activities and events and places, like in a way to kind of show the sort of the contradictions of the system too. And so coming to New York. Is of course like a very different city and place than Hong Kong. We set up in almost 5 years ago. This is the kind of office space. I don't know why there's no people in the picture, but there are people who work in the office, and we work in the garment district here, and this is actually also my partner Carolina, who's working while I'm talking. We also, I think being in New York and thinking about New York, wanted to kind of also reflect on where we were and where we are now. And actually this project is called Irregular Development, which is also the title of the talk because it's kind of a reflection on the city. And New York has been kind of theorized for its grid. The so-called 1811 Commissioner's Plan is shown here with the kind of what existed previously sort of superimposed on top of it. And so in a way, I guess we kind of found that the grid was not a kind of tabula rasa condition, that before it there were all these kind of forms of land ownership and natural systems and kind of infrastructure. And of course, a lot of artists have kind of in this case, Gordon Matta Clark looked at kind of the aberrations in the grid. And also, this is like a project that I came across this summer because I'm also teaching at Columbia University, and I brought students to Tokyo this summer, and we found this is an artist who was like documenting kind of vacant land in Shinjuku during the real estate bubble. And I think what's interesting about it is not just simply the kind of vacant lots, but actually the fact that since then, because of the kind of inheritance taxes, the city has been divided into 1.1 million individual lots or landowners, so that they kind of started subdividing lots basically, and the consequence of that is, as you may know, this kind of like emergence of kind of radically innovative like single-family houses as a type in Tokyo over the last 20 years. So I guess coming back to New York, I guess the point is like we're really interested in this kind of relationship as an office working between kind of architecture and urbanism. We're really interested in that relationship and kind of communication between architectural form and the kind of city. And And I would say actually that's definitely kind of connected to my experience of like working here in the Netherlands, because in the US we have a very strict kind of disciplinary divide between those who work in kind of urbanism and those who work in architecture, unfortunately. So anyhow, back to New York. This is our project, Irregular Development. We essentially cataloged using GIS the vacant irregular lots in New York City. There are 3,600 of them. These are, what you see here is I think mostly kind of narrow lots and also triangular lots. And we organize them all into kind of the shapes. So triangle being kind of obvious. The blue ones are actually owned by the city. There's 609 of them. Narrow lots are less than 5.5 meters, and that definition is actually from the zoning code, which says you can't do anything. You can't build on the lot. Although it's kind of this type of lot exists actually in Amsterdam. In New York, you're not allowed to do anything, and the same with lots being less than 93 square meters, small lots. And then this one we came up with is kind of self-explanatory. So this is an exhibition that we just put on in the Shenzhen Biennale. I think it's still up. And what we did is we took the kind of those 609 city-owned vacant irregular lots, and we put them on the wall. And then on the kind of 9 pedestals in the space, we developed some kind of speculative kind of housing prototypes that might occupy these kind of vacant lots. And so the irregular development is actually really connected to the question of housing for us, because I think because of the housing crisis that we actually find ourselves in New York now. You know, when and also the idea that maybe this is a kind of a model for participation by young architects, when you know, the sort of market forces of the city right now favor you know, big projects by big developers, by established architects. So the second chapter is really about housing. And I think actually housing for us is kind of connected to the sort of larger scale, because housing is like what most of the city is made out of. And if architecture with a kind of capital A is sort of concerned with the exceptional and the kind of different, I think that housing is probably concerned with the kind of non-exceptional and the everyday. And so our practice is really interested in housing as a type. But also kind of a renewed territory for architectural invention, which I think you could say was very important for the kind of modernists, but was perhaps like ignored by a previous generation, or for our generation becomes kind of relevant again. And I'm talking, like, I think specifically about American architectural practice, which even in the 70s was very engaged with like questions of kind of invention through housing at that time, like low rise, high density, etc. So anyhow, the first housing project is connected also to kind of irregular development. It's a self-initiated project actually on a narrow lot. So we bought this lot. It runs from the yellow truck to the wall here. And it's 4 meters wide. And although I think quite typical here, since 1953, New York City, the zoning, you can't use this kind of lot, but we found a sort of loophole because it existed prior to 1953, and this is a sort of proposal for a house that we have the building permit for now, and we're going to start soon. The interesting thing, I think, is in this kind of constrained situation, it's really like not about kind of form. It's really the volume of the building responds to the kind of setbacks and the givens by the zoning. And so the territory to kind of invent becomes the internal organization and the circulation. And so like rather than kind of configure it in a sort of typical way, we made like each part of the house is kind of an enlarged sort of stair landing. And so you can see here on the ground, it's like kind of totally open. And then that kind of split level continues as you move up through the house. On the ground, there's this like from the front, totally open to the back. and then from the inside to the backyard, and then looking back from the back to the front. And then you can also see that there's only 2 walls, and then there's just kind of this volume in the middle, which is evident on the floor plan above, which is just like a kind of wet and storage area, which has doors that kind of divide the kind of functions inside the house. So that's that guy right there. So that's a project that we're gonna start building soon, hopefully. Another housing project is also like a single-family house, a set of single-family houses, and here I think the constraints were not as clear, but they were in this case kind of self-imposed. And the point of this house was supposed to be kind of a set of houses as a kind of low-cost housing prototype with stick framing. And I think the constraint for us was the kind of square, and then the sort of ejection of the wet areas and the kind of circulation off to the side of the house. And then the bedrooms would be kind of like located above that. So in the section you can see those two bedrooms here in that kind of ground floor sort of open space. And the house was, there were like a couple different variations of it, basically on different lots. Here you can see that it's kind of reconfigured like horizontally. Not unlike what's called in the U.S. we like to name things after guns. It's kind of not funny right now, but it is. This is what's called a shotgun house. So, anyways, there would be kind of a whole set. Although it's kind of a single family house, it's also kind of a bigger sort of urbanistic idea as well. The third and final housing project is actually something that we've been working on for 2 years now, together with a community nonprofit developer in Brooklyn, and it's a senior affordable housing, which is a type that I think in the U.S. you have some pretty good examples here, like Hertzberger, but in the U.S. It's kind of a type that's sort of beset by kind of institutional design. And the constraints kind of drove the past few projects, and in a way this project also has its own kind of logic of efficiency, requiring certain efficiencies, and the idea was to kind of actually maximize those efficiencies to sort of produce excess elsewhere in the project. So here, in this kind of central space that we call the loggia, and the idea is that rather than kind of distributing the extra like at the bottom and the top, the building would actually frame it in the center. On the ground, it's kind of organized into like a bar, 2 bars on either side in a kind of circle, which keeps this kind of openness to the rear yard. And then so from the rear, you can also see there's this kind of staircase which leads up, which is kind of a sort of secondary circulation, leading up to the kind of the loggia, which we think of as like a kind of living room, like sort of an enlarged living room. So it's something weird happening here, I don't know, but in a kind of space, sort of domestic, enlarged kind of domestic space for the sort of residents. So those are kind of like 3 projects I would say that are very much part of our interest. Of course, we found that doing ground up projects in New York takes a long time and is very difficult, and so those are in progress. And really, I think since we started the office, the real ambition has been to kind of materialize our ideas. And in New York, interiors I think present certain kind of opportunities. Of course, one is speed, but also the ability to kind of make it happen, and of course I think to kind of also learn, because the results are much more immediate, and in a way we can also operate sort of very locally and kind of in a hands-on way. And so I'll show like 3 interior projects, 2 of which are built now. And another thing to kind of say is that we've also like in these projects we've started to kind of experiment with like taking on the role of the general contractor too, not by choice, but by kind of necessity. And so the first project is on a kind of unusual location. I think unlike Hong Kong, the ground is kind of a privileged datum. But here we were given, again, because I think young architects can sort of only participate on the margins, this kind of weird space in a subway concourse, which was like 53 square meters, 50 square meters. And it's actually on the kind of concourse, which is sort of the street, but it's not really the street. And so it's a coffee bar. It's arranged. Well, one thing to kind of say is that it's I think like the previous projects also very constrained. In this case, like geometry and budget were the sort of main constraints. But in a way, like the narrow house was kind of like sort of systematic reduction of kind of architectural expression. And I think here it's very different because we sort of wanted to be counterintuitively very figural in the plan with these kind of with of course with kind of simple geometries like these circles, and that's one thing that also I think kind of characterizes our work is like the desire to kind of work through sort of Platonic form and kind of simple gestures. And so in this case, there's like a circle for kind of coffee making, and then a positive circle for coffee making and the baristas, and then a kind of negative circle which is produces sort of seating. And that we also like never did any interiors before we came to New York and had no experience in this. And I think that we therefore kind of actually approached it in a naive and different way, because we saw it like not only as just kind of decorating and materials and light and color, but I think really about also kind of the structure of things, and in this case, like kind of different sort of social interactions that could take place. So the idea that in a very small space, you can sit alone against the wall, you can sit in kind of solitude, or you can sit alone facing the kind of street, to see passersby, or you can sit in a kind of group. And I think the plan arrangement kind of allowed us to produce these range of differences across like a very small and kind of compressed space. So here, that's the kind of coffee counter, and then looking into the kind of niche for seating over here. The materials are like really cheap in a way, or sort of like, let's say, a kind of a combination of kind of high and low. And we wanted to kind of avoid a lot of the cliches of coffee shops, which I think is now Brooklyn has kind of exported globally, like the sort of artisanal aesthetic of reclaimed wood and subway tile and exposed Edison bulbs and this kind of thing. And that was also partially because our client is an Australian engineer turned barista, and we got to work like really closely with him, and he was like super technical about the deconstructing the kind of water, taking out the acidity and the hardness of the water, and then reconstructing the water before it goes in the kind of coffee machine, and measuring everything that kind of goes in and out on digital scales and this sort of thing. And so anyways, he wanted the project to kind of convey his sort of scientific approach to coffee making, and I think that's the palette maybe sort of came from there, or the language of the palette came from there. So it's kind of a combination of like high and low. It's sort of things that are very cheap, like vinyl, perforated vinyl and black rubber, and the perforated metal, but then of course it kind of contrasts with like something more luxurious like the marble. And the walls were also made out of this the cheapest thing you can buy, OSB, and we painted it with aluminum enamel paint actually. And so that you can see how that kind of plays off. These two materials kind of also kind of play off of each other together. So. The other project that we've now realized is an office in New York, and it's for the office. It's actually an office for 3 companies, and they were very different. One of them, they're all sort of under the same management. One of them was in kind of fashion business, and that was the kind of creative end. And so working with them, we asked ourselves, like, also being in a kind of creative industry, what kind of space would we want to work in? And we started with something like very neutral. but also kind of a rule or a system that could unify the disparate parts. And so the rule was that everything is kind of black here and everything is white up here, and that so all the furniture was basically kind of because the project, they started building it 4 weeks after we were hired to design it. Everything had to be kind of black. It was easy, and the project actually had a lot of constraints, which is partially what explains the kind of floor plan. But so that's the kind of system that's set up. And then I think not to be too dogmatic, we also kind of introduced other sort of materials like the textured glass or beige kind of islands of material and texture and color throughout the kind of plan, gray felt and plywood. And then in the largest space, which is a kind of open plan, we had more free plan. We had this kind of mirrored modules that are actually they actually roll on the floor, and they contain like kind of display and also storage. And the idea is that you can kind of move them around to produce like 4 sort of showrooms, or one big showroom, or something more informal, or they can be packed in a way and kind of stored and sort of disappear through their kind of mirroredness. And so there was, again, I think here in this project, like the idea of not maybe taking ideas from kind of other scales, or sort of thinking about not just a kind of interior, but something flexible that would change and be able to kind of transform, as one might think of like a kind of city. And that's this third project is unbuilt. It's a project for Performa, which is like a kind of performing arts biennale in New York. And they had an invited competition for young architects to kind of produce like a space which would accommodate an impossible list of demands, like press point, library, lounge, screening room, cafe, event space, 200 things for a budget of 8,000 euro. And so our design was kind of about actually creating a kind of grid in the space, which would seem to kind of prohibit flexibility, let's say, but in fact, what it does is kind of receives a certain the crosses are actually kind of different heights, and they receive a series of different elements that could be like also sort of deployed and kind of moved around within the space as needed, and they're could accommodate presumably all these kind of functions within a sort of very structured space. And because we only had because they had no budget, we also the only material we could think of was this kind of cement CMU block, and we couldn't afford mortar or people who bricklayers. So they would be actually kind of strapped together, like with this kind of webbing that would maintain the kind of compressive strength of the space. And the idea is actually it's kind of, in a way, this also produces a kind of enfilade. And so the spaces can kind of change between being used as a stage for the kind of performance artists like Robin Rode here, or other kind of events and sort of installations. In this case, I think Erica Vogt is another performance artist who would be kind of using it. So that's our work at a very small scale. And then finally, I like to kind of, how am I doing on time, actually? Is it? Yeah, okay. I can slow down a little bit here. This one I can go into more detail, but. It can take 5 to 10 more minutes. Okay. That's okay. Yeah. Okay, so I'll return kind of like in the final chapter to sort of the city, a much larger scale. And I think you can see our interest maybe in systems and not just objects, how that informed other scales. But the interest in urbanism is really like this, the kind of necessity to sort of anticipate kind of uncertainty and informality and change at the city scale. And so we were, it's very hard to be involved in kind of large scale efforts as a young architect in New York. Actually, New York City has no master plan. Or at least one that's been updated. The last time it was updated was 1969. But there is something called the Regional Plan Association, the RPA. And they introduce, it's a kind of nonprofit basically, which publishes a kind of vision for the sort of greater region here. And the first one they did in 1929. They published the fourth one in this past year in 2017. And for the past one, they actually established a kind of competition to look at 4 different corridors: the ocean, the city, the suburbs, and the mountains. And our team, together with Matthijs Bouw from One Architecture, was fortunate enough to work on the kind of the smallest piece of it, which is actually quite big. It's like 40 kilometers long, and I don't know how to convert 80 square miles. And actually, right now, there's kind of the black is the outline of the corridor, and I'll explain the white line. There's 2.6 million people who live here between Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. And the RPA projected that this corridor that we were to study, would grow by 400,000 people by 2040. So that New York is adding about 1 million people in the next 20 years, according to the current rate of growth. And so there's been a lot of focus on Manhattan. Our previous mayor was, there were all these kind of inventions in, the High Line, city bikes, the 2nd Avenue subway was extended, but the outer boroughs have been kind of overlooked, and our current mayor, de Blasio, is much more interested in kind of equitability and affordable housing, and so the outer boroughs kind of come into focus. And so our first act was actually just to kind of rotate the map to sort of bring into focus this kind of non-Manhattan-centric region. And the corridor has a kind of funny shape, which is actually based on a set of existing underutilized freight and passenger train tracks. That's what gives the shape of it. And the kind of given problem for us is actually to envision a new train service, which would basically connect all the outer boroughs. And what that does is changes Manhattan from a kind of radial train system into one that has a kind of circumferential connection. And so, for instance, the L train is about to go out of service for a year. And so people could kind of really in a way, this produces more sort of resiliency and redundancy because you can kind of divert to essentially get back to the center, right? So we were asked to kind of envision this and also kind of understand its implications. And so we just kind of looked at what it is as in this case as a kind of exquisite corpse of every condition you can imagine, like above ground, below ground, at grade, etc. And we observed that it also the repurposing of these freight and intercity lines into passenger service would also transect kind of diverse communities and social and economic demographics. And so really the question became, who gets to profit from the kind of improved connectivity and the increased livability and the new development opportunities, and how can we mitigate the negative impacts of gentrification here, and how can we make sure that the area is transformed to become even more important as a kind of emancipation and empowerment engine for the area. So our idea was to kind of actually maintain its kind of diversity, and the project plays out through kind of 3 layers. The first layer is a kind of public project, which I'll come back to in a second. It involves the kind of greening of public space along the corridor. The second layer, which is shown here, is a kind of public-private project. And the third layer is kind of community-led and driven mechanisms for development and growth, which I won't cover in much detail. But this is the kind of, as I said, the kind of public-private project. There's actually 25 new stations, which create these sort of intermodal connections through, between the train and the subway and bicycles and other kind of current and future forms of mobility. And this is actually also kind of like a huge drawing that I'll just sort of pan through as I'm talking about it. But the idea is that some stations like Avenue I and H, I think that, yeah, like some of them are really simple platforms. Other are kind of areas which require sort of may benefit actually from upzoning and from increased density. And those are really each tied to kind of certain economic sectors which are not necessarily centered in Manhattan. So for instance, here at Brooklyn College, we envision kind of a new business school, which would help connect these trains and buses and this kind of link, but also play into kind of a larger idea of the sort of knowledge corridor. And the other industries would be like education, healthcare, logistics, manufacturing, and food. And so really the idea is that they're not the kind of non-Manhattan-centric industries would develop and kind of benefit from these new sort of stations. So really it's more than, we saw it as more than just a kind of transit project, and really about new kind of relationships and proximities between the workforce and kind of workplaces. And also to kind of really, what you see is kind of the idea of like producing a kind of drawing that would sort of bridge the gap between the architectural form and the kind of city scale, because so often the kind of urbanists represent things from a kind of the macro level and a kind of policy level, and so we wanted to kind of see through distorting kind of scales to kind of see what these would be, be like. And so we're not just interested sort of in the nodes, but also the kind of in between spaces. And this is part of that first layer, the kind of public project, which is really the corridor becoming kind of 40-kilometer long linear park, and using the existing right-of-way to accommodate like kind of public spaces, sort of bicycle superhighway that would connect in the same way the train does. And I mean, it's an interesting project because actually, when you work at such a large scale, it's kind of impossible to sort of produce like a master plan. There is no master plan, and especially with the kind of the sort of the way in which the market forces drive everything. It was really we wanted to be very specific about kind of certain things that would happen in certain places. Like for instance, new kind of microgrids and decking over the kind of the track. And new types of kind of like infill housing, or using like kind of creating like larger parks or these kind of things, or just simply using that width, building within the existing FAR to avoid actually upzoning the majority of areas, and then infilling vacant lots. So anyways, we also developed this kind of technique of these section obliques, which on the one hand are very specific and keyed into certain places. And on the other hand, they would also be kind of somewhat generic or prototypical in that they could be deployed along, you could imagine like sliding them up and down the extent of the corridor so that they could happen in different places. And really in a way, it's a kind of, I would say, envisioning the city through a kind of, through a sort of toolkit. A kind of toolkit of strategies. The second, I showed two more urban scale projects. Actually, these projects are all like super different because they are responding to very different kind of policy and political contexts. This is a project in New Jersey, which is done by a developer, and there's a joke about New Jersey that. Places are like named after the highway exits that they're on, and here actually it is literally exit 21. Anyways, here this was a project to accommodate about 1,200 housing units, and typically this would become kind of suburban sprawl. Our idea was to kind of actually give it a kind of structure around this around a block grid, which is 60-something meters by 60 meters, very tight, but comparable to kind of other cities, let's say. And that would actually kind of produce sort of more walkability within the kind of plan. But on the other hand, it would produce more streets, which could actually accommodate more kind of parking on the street without having to build off-street parking. And so the project we saw, our intervention was really the kind of the grid. And then the idea that all these different kind of range of different density of housing and types of housing could be played out in that grid according to the kind of uncertainty of the market. And as a developer project, like, literally one block being built at a time, incrementally to accommodate different types, which would then have their own kind of parking, their own kind of parking requirements and in this case, the kind of spiral in the middle of the block. So this is like in a way kind of one outcome of the project, but because it's such a big project too, we thought and considered a lot about the kind of public spaces in it. We proposed these sort of like two, a kind of village green and two kind of axes crossing each other, and then some kind of key public buildings that would sort of frame those axes. And then our scope of our work also kind of extended in a way to the kind of public spaces and the streets and the streetscapes and this sort of thing. Finally, a project in China in another kind of completely different context, probably the opposite of New York, where we were. It's a project for a campus, and we were told that actually there would be only one phase, and everything would be built in a kind of top-down way and in a single kind of move, and so it also needed to kind of accommodate like a range of different building types. But our idea was actually maybe somehow to kind of express this in the kind of project and look for a kind of structure which would register that. And the other requirement kind of given to us was that 50% of the ground had to remain built and 50% kind of unbuilt. I think Boss was actually responsible for this, worked on this project as well, was responsible for this kind of rule from the broader kind of master plan. So I guess our idea was to kind of like accommodate these different types within a kind of gradient here and a kind of checkerboard, and that would also like create these kind of different scale sort of pockets of public space, which would be sort of slipping or kind of interlinked with one another, and in fact also kind of sit within a kind of existing street grid, which is a kind of given, which is a weird thing to actually have, going through a campus. So we thought this is the kind of three-dimensional version of that. And then our idea was like then to, actually to kind of stitch it back together through the introduction of this sort of elevated network of, Xi'an is very cold in the winter. And so there's this kind of elevated grid, elevated network of pedestrian paths that kind of cuts through all the buildings and then sort of extends all the way into the kind of dormitory ends on the other side. So that's the work that I wanted to share with you, and obviously a broad range of kind of ways of working in scales. And so thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Before coming up to you guys for questions and remarks on this very interesting presentation, thank you. Listening to what you've been saying, and also by talking earlier today, I found three characteristics of Only If that would fit the Amsterdam Agenda quite well. And I would like to check them with you to see if you agree on that one. I thought the first one that let's say as an only if way of working that would also work for Amsterdam would be finding the margins, how to level between the large-scale commercial movements and mechanisms and the individual designer trying to find the spots to do something unique. Is that something that would apply to Amsterdam in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think we can't really, the kind of economic system that we operate in right now. We don't have as architects we have to participate in it, right? I mean, we don't have a choice to kind of resist the world, as exists. And so I think therefore to kind of participate, but also to be kind of critical, one has to find the kind of cracks where you can kind of insert yourself in. And I think that maybe that's how we haven't thought of it like that, but maybe that is something that we're trying to do, yeah. So, and I think that it seems like Amsterdam is also kind of a city that is changing a lot now, and there's, in fact, it's kind of it's built out, I mean, I know that there's kind of areas, sort of industrial areas and docklands, which are being kind of redeveloped. But maybe I'm not the best person to answer this, but perhaps for like architects of my generation working here, the opportunity to kind of do big things is limited. So therefore, yeah, the other areas where we can kind of insert ourselves.
And that would also mean, also based on the project you've been showing, that you are kind of confined, well, maybe not confined, but focusing on, let's say, the existing city. Like when you're looking for irregular developments, and your vacant plot research is very, very interesting, of course. The cracks in the system are probably within the built environment and not in the newly developed areas. Do you agree on that?
Yeah, I think within the existing city, I think we're also though trying to like kind of see it differently too. I mean, like the project about Hong Kong was an effort. I think Hong Kong was seen as kind of or it's sort of known as by its kind of skyline, and the public space was said to be kind of non-existent, or it wasn't actually mapped. The city didn't have any maps of this kind of system, and so we wanted to kind of bring that out and visualize that. So maybe a different or new way of seeing the city. And similarly in New York, I think the vacant lots are not so known. I mean, there's a kind of known history of urban renewal in the 70s, but just the idea that there's like empty areas in New York is kind of, it took us a while actually of kind of being there and close looking to sort of figure out. And to be honest, actually, also irregular development was kind of we did the house before we did this irregular development, and so it's kind of a retroactive manifesto because we simply spent like a long time looking for like a place, moving there, looking for a place to kind of buy an apartment. Then why don't we move very far out and buy a garage, and then actually wait after 6 months, there's actually vacant pieces of land, like why don't we do a kind of house. So it was a kind of discovery, and I think the project we want to show the city differently and show the kind of, I think especially also because Rem Koolhaas wrote about the kind of grid and the grid like also kind of preoccupied everyone else. We wanted to see like the not grid too. So I think it's not only about like operating within the kind of existing, but inventing a new kind of existing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then you found 609 vacant city-owned plots. Yeah. Didn't you get a golden medal or something? Because you have so many pieces of land to be developed and to be used. Didn't they come? Isn't there sort of for the follow-up, or is there a sort of city policy being developed on how to, build them?
Yeah, well, the agency who kind of owns a lot of them, there's a lot of inertia with them, I think, and the city, during our project, actually, the comptroller, I don't know how you say this in Dutch, is like somebody who audits the financial performance of and assets of the city, actually put out a report also noting that not specifically like irregular lots, but more just like kind of empty land that the city owns is not doing anything with. He noted that, but they haven't done anything yet about it, and I think we would probably, I don't know if we get a gold medal, but I think if we were to actually like take advantage of it and like buy them ourselves or use them ourselves, maybe then we would be awarded or something. But
you would get rich eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah, and because I was reminded a little bit of Rotterdam, because the vacant plots and the overlooked plots are quite impossible to find in Amsterdam, I think. But in Rotterdam there are quite a lot, and you need a specific way of looking at the city to see them, to find them, to discover them. It's probably the same in New York, but in Rotterdam they developed a policy how to develop those plots. Yeah. And the last one was the concept of flexibility, which you mentioned them already, which seem to be supported by grids and layers on all scales. Looking at your project, the urban plans are more or less from the same way of thinking grid and layer-wise as, for example, the coffee shop. So how would Amsterdam improve from this grid and layer approach?
Well, I think yeah, it's like, maybe it works for some cities, but not for others. I mean, in Hong Kong, there was this, we spent a while after making cities without ground thinking about what it meant, because we discovered this kind of intricate, complex kind of forms, and does that, did that kind of instigate us to kind of create more complex urban fabrics, or something based on that? I'm not sure necessarily. It's just kind of in a way, like a kind of fascination with what exists, and not necessarily something that told us that we had to act in this way. So I think maybe when we, I don't know if this answers your question, but when we kind of engage conditions which are less rich, we try to work in very simple and straightforward ways to kind of envision how the complexity of life or things might like play out within them, right? So like I think that's the, and so I'm not totally sure how that relates to either Hong Kong or Amsterdam, which also has this kind of like so many pre-existing layers of historical layers and systems, and increasingly, I think three-dimensional ways of developing the city too, right? From the kind of underground spaces and ideas of kind of water and this sort of thing, which is also up and down.
So it's also a way of being able to read the complexity life as it is by putting layers and grids over them to be kind of less complex.
Yeah, to be less complex but not simplistic. And I think that's like also we're I think trying to stake our position in contrast to like a previous generation where there was like this I think less here but more in US academia, like this obsession with kind of complexity and form and the potential of digital tools and parametricism to generate more and more complicated things, and like it's not, I think we have too many problems already. And if we really think about the kind of like the city and the kind of issues that we face, and I'm not sure it's
Baroque thinking is what you called it, right?
Yeah.
Baroque architecture, kind of a new.
Yeah,
Let's include you into the conversation. Is there anybody who has a question, who wants to comment on the projects being shown, or to add to the Amsterdam Agenda based on all this information coming to you?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Adam. This isn't so much about Amsterdam, it's a bit of a broader question. So before Amsterdam, I lived in London for 15 plus years. And in that time, I've seen spaces, living spaces in particular, become divided, subdivided. And I worry about the psychological impact on people from living in these smaller and smaller spaces. I wonder how much you consider the psychological impact of these, of the sizes of the things you're dealing, especially when you're dealing with these small spaces.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think in the senior housing project, there's like this very small unit that you saw that's like 33 square meters. And we thought a lot about that, and ultimately that was kind of already, the whole obsession with, tiny houses or small living spaces, or even Higa this year is like, I've read that it's also kind of justifies these kind of neoliberal forces that are squeezing us like more as the cost of land goes up, and that the way in which speculation plays out through kind of real estate. I mean, I think particularly in London, that it's not a choice that we're making. It's something that is being produced now by these factors that are kind of outside of our control. And so to say that to say we just want more space, or to say we just produce more space, is kind of like almost not a question if you want to participate, if you want to actually do things, right? But there is, I think, the question of how we can produce these small spaces with quality, and so therefore, in the senior housing project, it became very important with the kind of tight footprint, the ceiling, of course, the ceiling height. It became very important how many windows there were. It became very important that we didn't have balconies, which would also kind of block daylight from coming into the space. So there were like a whole range of kind of potential reactions to that. that I think we've tried to kind of incorporate. And then I guess like with the narrow house, which we're going to live in when we build it, hopefully, is like also like very, very compressed in a way. It's not, you know, the proportions are totally different here. I mean, there's a lot more kind of excess here in a way because we can do that since we're like designing it for ourselves. But there is there is a lot of thinking about how to make that kind of inside whatever it is, 3.2 meter dimension, kind of like livable or sort of humane and with kind of daylight and stuff. So yeah.
Any other questions?
It's about the first project, the book project you showed. In Holland, there have been quite a few, of a lot of attention to multinodal transit areas, and they've been developed and a lot of changes. But these have all been very local, and what you're showing is a multinodal sprawl. And I was wondering how you do you see any benefits, or what kind of lessons did you get from that, and that could be applied to urban questions in other cities?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's like also, I mean, it's something we thought about a lot too. Like, what do we get out of this for us, like as also, you know, designers? And I think in Hong Kong it kind of works. You're right that it's kind of the 32 maps are actually kind of also interconnected, and so they're nodes, but they're networked, and I mean, the idea of like kind of this segregation of pedestrian traffic and car traffic and multi-layered space, of course, has like played out. I mean, there's a lot of failures of it, from, you know, Hilbersheimer, Santelia, these kind of modernist fantasies to, you know, kind of actual failed modernist projects. But it works in Hong Kong because I think of three factors. One, the kind of topography, two, the kind of density, and three, the climate. And it's interesting that it is kind of seen as a kind of model, I think, particularly like in China, that they want to build cities like this. So we did like another competition where we're given, the brief says there will be public space at 0, 5, 25, and 50 meter heights. And like, how do you do that? I think you need like you need kind of density so that they're sort of occupied. And so I think it doesn't really work in other places, but maybe as we like start to face kind of climate change and the cities by necessity maybe also become more dense, it could be a model, I think, that could kind of like that could play out. But we've seen like it doesn't. I mean, in New York there's also just kind of like a totally different cultural attitude. There's just the kind of the ground is kind of privileged, right? And nothing, you know, retail more or less can't, you know, except for like Voyager Espresso, it can't happen like above ground or below ground very easily. So so it's a model for kind of like certain places in a way, and yeah.
Thank you. There's another question here.
Yeah. Actually, there's a lot of discussion right now about density, especially in relation to Amsterdam. And I think soon the moment will come that we'll have to expand again beyond the limits of the city. And it's I think, a very difficult subject right now. Do you think should Amsterdam go into height, build more towers, for example, to get to this like critical mass? Because in an international context, I think Amsterdam's not that dense actually, if you compare it to the cities you are showing.
Yeah, we looked at like actually also the kind of, when we came to New York, just to kind of like, we compared the kind of density somehow of New York and places in Hong Kong. And it turns out New York is not that dense either. I mean, there's like, you know, Kowloon in Hong Kong, Kowloon has like, I think twice the density of Manhattan or something. So, and Kowloon actually doesn't have that. There's a lot of parts of it that are like not skyscrapers, right? I mean, it's kind of like high density, low rise. And with like 10-story buildings, you know, you achieve like an FAR of like 6 or 8 or something. Of course, that again, that kind of only, that there's kind of daylight conditions there that are different here, and it only kind of works. And so I'm not, I'm not particularly sure how Amsterdam can or should develop, but I know that, I mean, also just looking at New York, I think that it's the question of density is like it's very complex, and it's very like, you know, number one, how do you measure it? Like, do you measure just kind of like housing units, or, I mean, for instance, in New York right now, I mentioned we have this kind of housing crisis, and there's one way to measure that is that we have 83,000 homeless people right now in the city, is like kind of unimaginable, and for the most prosperous, wealthy nation on earth ever, anytime. And on the other hand, we have the highest rate of vacancy ever in New York City because of luxury towers that go up as vehicles for foreign direct investment and speculation. And so, you know, the density there, like maybe it's not the question, right? Maybe it's kind of other elements. And I think also as like the idea of work kind of changes and people no longer work in office buildings versus like, you know, kind of commute from home to office to home. Like there's a question of kind of like in New York, we also, you know, now a lot of what's happening is kind of the repurposing of former office buildings in the financial district into kind of housing. And so I think that there's like a lot of different ways to kind of address density. And we, you know, I mean, it might, sometimes density might be a kind of proxy for other kind of concerns. And finally, another just kind of interesting thing about which sort of drove the regional plan, are ideas about, I mean, the obvious way to kind of achieve more density is to upzone, right? To allow more buildable area in certain parts. Our mayor upzoned a part of the city called East New York, like about 2 years ago. And it was an experiment to kind of try to achieve the 200,000 new units of affordable housing. However, what happened is that investors came in, they bought, the price of everything went up by twice. Everybody got displaced out of it, and nothing's gotten built yet. And so now what's happened in the last 2 years is all of a sudden the question of upzoning becomes completely, like, we can't talk about upzoning anymore in New York. So, you know, I think there's like these really, what I've seen in Hong Kong is that there is kind of, I mean, which has its own problems, but I think cities have a kind of capacity to do certain things, you know, maybe in ways that are beyond just kind of growing their footprint, and they can be kind of changed in ways. We like to think they can be changed in ways that might support, you know, the kind of needs of growth or, you know, whatever new futures that happen there. So
Sort of like start building again instead of developers?
I do think so, yeah, but I don't think that's the kind of reality. I mean, I think that there's a role for architects. I mean, I think the problems are created and perpetuated and will ultimately be solved through politics and policy. However, I think that we also have a role as architects to kind of envision new ways of living together, right? I think that's and I think we haven't done that since, almost like kind of since modernism. I'm sort of exaggerating, but I think we need to kind of get back to that actually, and like engage housing as a kind of issue. But I don't. I'm also kind of aware that I don't think we can fix it, and I don't think, you know, at least we can't fix it on our own. And at least in the U.S., we don't. There's not. We don't have a lot of reasons to be optimistic right now, in terms of what the government, you know, can and will do, right? I mean, they're dismantling it right now. So.
Yeah, my question my question follows on from that actually, and it's because you're talking quite a lot about the economic policy in New York and the situation with zoning and the economic model for building housing, and you framed the mapping of the small sites through a kind of lens of affordability, and now you're kind of developing yourself one of the plots with this narrow house. And I was wondering if you consider to go further into the sort of development model yourself as a space also for design that hasn't really been broached for a long time, as you say, by designers, but it seems like there's quite a lot of opportunity now with new technologies and ways that we can automate the process as well as kind of automate the design, and that there might be ways that risk can be distributed also, and that this might be a space in which architects could actually take some more agency in the development role.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it's something we're like thinking about a lot, and like if the Narrow House, when it's successful, I think that also creates a kind of case study for us, like to think about. We were talking actually earlier, like about. I mean, we were acted as general contractor for some of the, for some of the projects, the small interior projects which we did, which. When you're an architect in the U.S. on this type of project, our fee is less than 1%. When you're a general contractor, your fee is 18 to 21%. So, to kind of vertically integrate like developer to architect to general contractor, there's maybe opportunities to like make a more viable model or like regain control or these kind of things. And I don't. You also mentioned kind of like risk, and I'm not sure. I've come to realize like after like now 4 or 5 years that it's we're always told like architects shouldn't be developers because it's too risky, or they make a lot of money because they take more risks. But like doing competitions is really risky, or like being an architect and doing like working for some client who you don't know, you have to trust, is like also like really risky, and it also like goes wrong sometimes too, and like so
it costs a lot of money too.
Yeah, and it costs a lot of money. So yeah, we're kind of like really thinking about that. The problem is there's not so many like role models who have done that. John Portman, maybe. I don't know. Like, I worry that when you do that, you lose sight of like design somehow maybe. So I don't know. I mean, we're gonna try it. I think definitely. But yeah, there's a big discussion, I would say, also at where I teach about kind of like alternative forms of practice. And if you asked me like a couple of years ago, I would say like I want to be an architect, like architect capital A. And now I think the students who are under very different constraints than I was when I was a student because of debt and this kind of thing, they're actually thinking, they see that like it's that the profession is like becoming obsolete, and they're actually also thinking of new models in which they can practice. And I think like 5 years ago would be like 5 or 10 years ago, like going towards technology, or thinking about like, for instance, Pinterest was started by Columbia graduate students in architecture, like going into just kind of leaving architecture. But now I think it's maybe more about like how to still make buildings, but find like a different way to do it.
Thank you. Any more questions? Then I may have one last question for you. I really liked how you connect the project you've shown to how you view your role as an architect, or a future role as an architect within society and urban fabric and the mechanisms of money and politics, etc. So all the projects you've shown are also about obstructions, restrictions and stuff. And your office is called Only If. So what is the one thing you need to be the architect you want to be?
Oh wow, that's such a hard question.
That tops the success question, right?
Yeah, that's harder than the question I got yesterday, which is what is success? The one thing we need, well, I don't know. I mean, if we knew what it was, I think we would find it or get it or make it. Maybe that's part of the kind of beauty of it, is like we don't know where we're going. We don't know how or where it will lead. But I think I can answer like kind of what we need right now. I think is to like
what makes you feel useful?
What makes us feel useful? Well, that's
not necessarily successful.
Yeah. Okay, but that's a different. Maybe let me. The first question. That's another hard one. But I think I can say what we need like kind of now or immediately is like really to kind of. And what I think New York also kind of, to a certain extent, kind of provides is like to be able to kind of connect with like interesting people, whether they're clients or people we collaborate with, or other forms of kind of collaboration that push us further. Because that's always what I had like when I was working somewhere else. And so I think in the near term, it's really kind of like seeking out these kind of relationships that we can you know, like the espresso bar was like, just because it was a kind of amazing person to work with and who saw what we were doing and trusted us and this kind of thing. And so I think that's like, that's what we need now.
Trust.
Yeah. Trust.
Only if you trust us.
Yeah, only if you trust us.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah.
A big applause. The next edition of Amsterdam Agenda is next week, and then Neville Marsh will be here talking about urban sustainability. Hope to see you next time. Pay as you like, and see you downstairs at the bar. Thank you.